All right, so hi and welcome to this month's Ballotpedia Insights. Again, I mentioned before, but for those tuning in, please feel free as we go along, if any questions come up as we're discussing today's topic, send them over to us either on the comments in Facebook or on the live Zoom chat, and we'll get them answered at the end. But if you are new to Media Insights, it's a monthly Q&A. Sorry, the cat immediately jumped on.
Awesome.
He knows when we're about to have an exciting discussion. So feel very proud of that, Chuck. So Insights is a Q&A with politicians, legal scholars, researchers, reporters, and subject matter experts. And we just want to invite people in this field on to discuss what it is like working in different areas and to answer any questions our readers might have about these subject matters. So today, it's always one of my favorite ones. It's a book club day. And with us is Chuck Marohn. Mr. Marohn is the founder and president of Strong Towns. He is a professional engineer licensed in the state of Minnesota and a land use planner with 2 decades of experience. He holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a master of urban and regional planning, both from the University of Minnesota. He has presented strong town concepts in hundreds of cities and towns across America. And he is featured in the documentary film Owned, A Tale of Two Americas, and was named one of the top 10 most influential urbanists of all times. So welcome, Chuck, and thanks for joining today.
Thank you. And I should let you know that we do Zoom staff meetings all the time, and there are animals everywhere. It's part of the ambiance of our meetings. So I'm just fine with cats interrupting.
Normally, I remember to lock. The dogs are locked in the bedroom, but I always forget about that darn cat. So
yeah. We have cats, dogs, babies. It's a whole cornucopia of crazy. Lots of fun.
One of the benefits we all get of working remotely, I guess.
Yeah.
So Chuck is here today to discuss his latest book, which is Strong Towns, a bottom-up revolution to rebuild American prosperity, which seeks to explain why cities of all sizes continue to struggle to meet their basic needs and reveals the new paradigm that can solve this long-standing problem. So this book will officially be released tomorrow, so we wanted to have Chuck on today to discuss some overviews from the preview we were able to read, and then just to talk about the concept and ideas of strong towns generally. So I'll go ahead and kick off with, again, I've had the privilege of getting to see a small snapshot of the book and an outline of what will be in the chapters. And there are a few things that I pulled out. And then we also have a few overall questions and a few questions submitted by the readers. But first, for a broad general overview question, what problem is the book discussing, and what do you hope readers learn through Strong Towns the book, and then generally Strong Towns the organization, just to kind of ease people into the ideas of your organization?
Yeah, Strong Towns started as a blog back in 2008 when I started to write about the cities that I had worked with and why they were struggling financially. This was right when the housing crisis was starting to hit. And it hadn't really trickled down to cities yet. We had the subprime meltdown. People were getting foreclosed on. The economy was having, to get bailed out, and all these terrible things were happening. But cities are on a kind of delay in a sense. And so it was a couple years before this creeped in. And even before the difficulties of that crisis started to hit cities were struggling mightily. These places that I was working with, doing big infrastructure projects and big economic development projects and zoning and planning and all this work, they were growing very robustly, and they had lots of growth. All the top line metrics looked great. But when they get to the end of the year, their budget was fried. I mean, their budget had huge gaps, huge backlogs of maintenance. They're laying off important key staff. They're not filling important positions. And I was just frustrated by the fact that the work I was doing, which was ostensibly to create all this prosperity, really wasn't resulting in prosperity. And so I started to write about that. And the book really starts with an exploration of why our cities struggle financially. Mm-hmm. Why our current development pattern, our current way of building and assembling places, which often we just describe as like suburban or suburbia or auto-oriented, but I think goes much deeper than that, to a set of questions and problems we tried to solve immediately after the Great Depression and World War II. But it goes into, why this development pattern gives us kind of a sugar high of financial benefit with this long-term hangover financially, the ramifications of that, and then of course, how we start to think about our places differently and do things in a different way. We strongly believe that we need a bottom-up revolution. We need to start looking at our cities not as the lowest form of a government, but as the base foundation of our society, and really the strength that we build everything else on. And when you take that view, it prompts you to ask a whole different series of questions than what our culture is currently asking.
Oh, it's a fascinating topic because, for us at Ballotpedia, we talk a lot about the raw politics and not as much about the policies that maybe lead to why people get involved in politics. And this idea of communities and towns and trying to build that sense of community from the bottom up it's just a different way to look at things than we're generally used to here, just looking at the politics of it. So I'm really happy to have this discussion today. So in the preview, you discussed cities as becoming fragile. Can you give some examples of this fragility and how it's going to start really coming due in the next few years?
Absolutely. I worked on a lot of projects as an engineer, and this is not just my city. This is cities all over the country where we see this exact same thing. A developer will come in, say, for example, and say, I'll build I'll build this entire subdivision out. I'll create all the commercial buildings and the residential buildings. I'll put in all the required roads and streets and pipes and valves and drainage systems and everything that's needed. The only thing that you as the city need to do as part of this transaction is you agree to take on the long-term maintenance requirement. You'll provide police protection, fire protection, you'll fix the pipes, you'll fix the streets, you'll do all that stuff.
Sounds like a great deal.
It's an awesome deal for a city. And I worked on many of these. I remember I was in one meeting once and the council member goes, "You mean we get a free road?" It's like, yeah, free road. Here it is. I joke, it's a little bit like Oprah. You get a road, you get a road, you get a road, and everybody gets this free road. And the thing is, if you look at the cash flow from this, the city does great in that first life cycle, because you get all the permit fees up front, which are fantastic. Then you get all the new tax revenue from this new growth, and all those promises that you've made to go out and fix all this stuff, those don't come due for decades. The problem is when you actually look at the cost of those things, they dwarf the amount of money you brought in, the cumulative amount of money you brought in. And so what happens is we make up for this insolvency by doing the thing that worked. We grow more. And we tend to take on debt to make this happen. And so what you see is a very kind of predictable cycle that post-World War II development patterns have. They have this one generation of what we call the illusion of wealth, where it's, the new hot trendy place with all the cool shops and all the new development where all the affluent people live. Mm-hmm. And then you have a generation of stagnation where there's kind of a shakeout of that. The affluent people start to decamp. The people move on to the next hot space. You get kind of this slash and burn agriculture kind of development pattern where you see things start to not work right. Debt goes up, tax rates go up. And then you hit that third life cycle where you get all the decline pressure sets in. And what we see is that the modern American development pattern is really good at creating growth and solving that problem we had coming out of the Depression. How do we grow our economy? But it does it by sacrificing the stability, the actual wealth and prosperity of local communities. So we now today, 70 plus years into this experiment, have generated unprecedented levels of growth through infrastructure spending, through other programs we've created to induce more and more and more of this pattern. But our cities, our families, our small businesses have negative net worths. They're insolvent. They're stretched very thin. And they're, to use the word you started this question with, they're incredibly fragile. And we can't continue with a development pattern that robs our essential stability and wealth creation capacity at the local level just to hit a GDP target in Washington, D.C.
Right. So basically, it's the idea that we can't keep outgrowing the debt that's eventually going to come due.
And it's fascinating because our discussion on that, and you referred to politics, I once heard this kind of funny statement that there's 100 people in the Senate, all who believe they would make a
We're seeing
president.
this here, right?
And that was before our current president. So, I mean, I think it's a universal statement on power, right? The city council member is like the next county commissioner, and the county commissioner is the next, U.S. representative or the next governor. And there's this sense that we're always trying to climb this ladder.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think when we look at cities in that context, what we tend to look at is that they're like the lowest level of government. They're the ones that, if we can just fix the problem in Washington, D.C., if we can just hit this growth target, if we can just, make this thing work out, it will trickle down in a sense. Whether your trickle down mechanism is a centralized government or a centralized corporation, it will trickle down to the local level.
Mm-hmm.
And we just fundamentally think that's flawed, that if we're going to build prosperity, it actually has to start at the fractal level. It has to start at the block and the neighborhood. Strong blocks and neighborhoods create strong cities. Strong cities create strong regions create strong states, and strong states create a strong country. And you can't do it the opposite way.
Interesting. Okay, so kind of along these lines, the term that you used called spooky wisdom stood out to me a little bit, not just because tomorrow's October, but I'm wondering, can you explain to the listeners what spooky wisdom is in this context?
Sure. I'm an engineer, and as an engineer, I go to 4 years of university training and then take a couple big tests and do a long apprenticeship and then finally get a license to practice. Throughout that entire series of training and gaining knowledge, I was taught things like how to do traffic projections, how to work on traffic flow, how to read manuals, how to ascribe, the slope of what pipe should be. I learned that the city was essentially a combination of asphalt, concrete, steel, laid in place as a framework, and that's what a city is, essentially a complicated machine. As a planner, then I got a little bit more depth than that. I got the fact that cities also have different zoning classifications, different economic ratios. There's a whole bunch of things that you're taught as a planner that go beyond what engineers are taught on how to think of cities. But you still think of it as a place where, well, if we just zone for this much commercial property, it will backfill like this. And we just, set up these standards over here, this will happen. What I think we are starting to realize as a culture in mass, and maybe I'll use this analogy. I've heard the 20th century called the century of physics, but the 21st century called the century of biology. The difference between physics and biology is that in physics, you're using mathematics to derive an answer. In biology, it's more like a social science where you're using trends and probabilities to look at, kind of random, how complexity works out in emergent random ways. If you took all the ingredients of a rainforest and rearranged them somewhere else, you won't get a rainforest. You'll get something else. Rainforests are emergent. Once you start to grasp that cities are not machines and that we shouldn't think of them the way physicists think of math, but cities are more like biological things, and we should think of them the way biologists or social scientists look at complex adaptive systems. What you immediately recognize is that as an engineer, as a planner, as an economic development advisor, as a city administrator, as a human with a narrow understanding of the world, I am wholly inadequate to grasp everything that's going on. And everybody is wholly inadequate to grasp what's going on. There's and I've called it spooky wisdom. There's this spooky wisdom embedded in the way humans evolved their habitat using trial and error over thousands and thousands of years. There are things about the way we lay out streets, the way we set up buildings, the way we create our habitat, that responds to far more than the 1 or 2 or 3 variables that we've prioritized here in the 20th and now the 21st century. Let me give you one concrete example of this, one that freaked me out. Planners have long understood that humans have a propensity to walk near the wall. Jane Jacobs wrote about this. She said that humans were wall-hugging species. Christopher Alexander talks about this in the pattern language. It wasn't until I read a cognitive psychologist named Anne Sussman, who wrote about this thing called thigmotaxis, that I understood this had a scientific name. You can think about a mouse scattering, scurrying across the room, they'll hug the wall. You can think of a deer on the edge of a field, they hug the edge of the field, they don't go out into the center. And you can look at microbial creatures and under a microscope, and they'll have this random pattern that they move. But if you put a piece of metal in there that's linear, they will line up along it and start to go in a linear pattern along the edge of it. Yes. So Darwin described evolution as a conservative process. It conserves winning strategies, and it passes along, those strategies as like a basis for future tinkering. So at some point in our primordial past, wall hugging was a beneficial trait. The creatures who hugged walls prospered, where creatures who did not. And so we have, in a sense, in our brainstem somewhere, something that says you are better off along an edge than you are out in the open. And so when we look at historic cities before the modern era, what we see is that they have a lot of these edge conditions, and they don't make them too narrow where they feel tight or too wide where they feel open. They create these environments where it's very comfortable for a human to be in. These are not things we're taught in engineering school. They're not things we're taught in plant school. It's that spooky wisdom that is embedded in this traditional way of building human habitat that we've largely forgotten.
Okay, well, one, now I'm going to have to just walk into the middle of roads just to rebel against this. But two, so how do you think then, as you're crafting the idea of a true community and a really strong city, how does that, something like that then, how should that be factored into the end result?
That's a really good and I think difficult question. Because quite frankly, we evolved our human habitat to a point, and then we largely threw that evolutionary history away. We decided in our hubris that we could do things way better. And it's a little bit like, I think you can think of this analogy. Imagine a beehive, and bees, we understand, have created hives to respond to their needs. If you look at a beehive, you wouldn't expect it to be built like an ant colony, because bees and ants are very different. They have different ways of creating their own habitat that responds to them. But what if, bees had a little council and they said, you know what, this beehive has been a little crowded. We could increase our honey production if we just, created some bee cul-de-sacs and some bee frontage roads. And we'll create a big, center shopping place for bees. We'll just throw away this beehive concept, and we'll come up with something completely different.
We'll give some tax breaks for some new bees.
Yeah, we'll do all this. Because you know what? Being a bee is hard, and it's difficult, and we struggle, and sometimes it gets too tight in here, and sometimes this person's not very nice to that person. So let's fix all these problems once and for all, and here's our plan to do it. We would find that to be absurd, right? We understand that the beehive has kind of evolved for the bees, and while it is not, in a sense, stuck in time, like it can change and shift, and beehives will ostensibly look different 10,000 years from now than they do today. They'll look slightly different because they will evolve and they will adapt. We understand that throwing it away with a new experiment would be foolish. It would be foolhardy. This is what we've done. We took all this knowledge we had about building cities, and we understood that there were problems with it. Because there were. No one's suggesting that the pre-Depression city was a perfect place. There were struggles. We decided to address a few of those struggles in this comprehensive way by reshaping an entire continent. Mm-hmm. What you just asked me is, now that we have this weird new beehive completely redesigned and reimagined along new paradigms that don't respond to human wants and needs. How do we fix it? And I'm like, I don't know. That's a really tough question.
Right.
Nobody has ever tried to do something like that before. Nobody's ever been faced with that challenge. And so part of our approach, part of our conversation is to say, look, here's the financial part, which we know is broken. Here's the part that renders this insolvent and is creating all the instability. We need to start dealing with that, but we need to deal with it in a humble and incremental way so that we can, over time, raise our awareness and our understanding of all the nuances of human habitat and start to incorporate those again into our pattern of development. And let me give you one example. Oftentimes when we see cities who are like, well, we have this insolvency problem, they do exactly what you suggested earlier. Let's get the big tax subsidy. Let's bring the big developer in. How about this? We'll do it opportunity zones where we'll allow Wall Street capitalists to put millions of dollars into poor neighborhoods, building Starbucks and Costco's and multi-story condo units, because that will be good for everybody. And what we see is that, like, yes, that does actually solve one set of problems. How do we make this neighborhood more valuable? But it creates a myriad of other ones, such as, what do we do with all the people that are there now that are struggling? Well, we just kick them out. I mean, that's been the thing. And that's been like, well, we don't really like that. Maybe we can come up with a regulation to deal with that. What we're suggesting is that we have that problem times 1,000. We need to incrementally start to repatch these cities back together, to re-stitch them. And when we do it incrementally, what we are forcing ourselves to do is learn from the process, to get that feedback, to respond to it, and to understand more the implications of our actions, to bring more people along in that change. And so that is a long way of saying, I don't have the answer, but we have a process to try to get to it.
This feels, as you're talking about, it's almost a patchwork approach that now has been taken on since whatever happened in the post-World War II era, we realize now isn't great. And so we've had these patchwork solutions. It reminds me of my elementary school was built in the 70s when this idea of an open classroom was all the rage. And so I distinctly remember the pods and how they threw the traditional way of, closed classrooms, quiet learning spaces, and went to this open learning. And then within a decade, they started putting up temporary walls, temporary doors, and it's, they're trying to fix this problem that was created because we thought we had this revolutionary new way of doing things. And now it's been patchworked back to closing off the classrooms, creating the class setting rather than this open, chaotic group. And to me, that comes as a parallel example to exactly what you're talking about.
It totally is. And let's ascribe this to what it really is, which is affluence. When you are part of an affluent society, and understand every society has the liberal and the conservative instinct, and each person has it to some degree within them too. The conservative instinct is a deference to the past. The liberal instinct is a frustration with the past and a desire to change things to be better. And I think we can embrace both of those at the local level in a poorer, less affluent age. What happens then is you get these kind of systems of operation that are historic and traditional. We can also call them hierarchical and oppressive. The two sides of the same coin. And we combine that with the liberal tradition, which is reformist and compassion, and let's look at the injustices in this and let's push on that. In a poorer time, those two would fight at the local level, and you would have people advocating for tradition and you would have people advocating for change, but your reach would be limited by your resources. We can only do so much because we're rather poor. This is where you get things like houses that all face the street and open up onto the street, because now we're doing self-policing in this neighborhood. We got, all of us kind of looking after each other. You get people who live in arrangements where you can kind of watch over each other's kids in a safe environment. You flip it around and you say, okay, now we're very affluent. And what you see is this lurching between the hyper top-down conservative instinct and the hyper top-down progressive instinct, which is let's change everything overnight because everything's a tyranny, and let's change it all right now and throw it all away. And then you get the reaction to that was, no, let's go back in and force like everything back to the way it was.
Right.
And it is a healthy debate, but not at the place we're having it, right? It is a healthy debate for us to have, but not in, these two. I saw this one political cartoon a while back where it's basically like our government, two sides fighting over a big chasm trench, and one side trying to pull the other into this trench. And the reality is, we should be having this debate all the time in every place. That's the tension of humanity. But it should be happening at the local, it should be happening at the block level. It should be happening at the community level. That's where it's actually the most effective.
So that's a great segue into one of the reader submitted questions that I received last week, which is, so here's the question. Strong Towns positions itself as a bottom-up, incremental approach to stabilizing our communities. This reader wonders, since we are so close to a presidential election year, what would a Strong Towns platform look like regarding infrastructure, but also how the federal government might or might not incentivize or otherwise encourage or discourage local and state level land use policies, among other things?
Yeah. Election years are always very difficult for us as a conversation because everybody asks us this question.
Right, I can imagine. It's tough one.
Who should we vote for president? Who should, we be what should the platform be? And, I think the one thing that we have to say is the one thing that nobody wants to hear, which goes kind of along the lines of what is often talked about as subsidiarity, but really gets to this idea of expanding the local toolbox. In our obsession with efficiency, and that's an obsession tied closely to this growth economy we've created, this economy we created to answer the challenges of the Great Depression. We have been willing to sacrifice basically the tools or the capacity of local government to adapt and change and heal itself. In fact, oftentimes when we have struggles, the way we react to a struggle is to turn around and take more tools away from local government. We say, okay, you can't raise your taxes this much, or you can't change this law, or you're not allowed to do certain things. And that's considered governance. The federal government does this to the states all the time. They turn around and say, okay, we don't really like that wacky thing that California just did, so nobody gets to do that ever again, or anything even remotely like it. And so there's this natural kind of centralization of power, both in the political side and in the economic side, that we see manifest in Washington, D.C. and in Wall Street, that we just believe is unhealthy. At the end of the day, if we want our cities to be strong, they need to be able to adapt, to change, to evolve, to have new understandings emerge. If you study ecosystems, you recognize very quickly that some emergent characteristics are evolutionary dead ends, like they don't work, they're bad ideas. I embrace.
What would be an example of that?
Well, most species that have ever existed have died out. I mean, they're gone.
Yeah.
Dinosaurs were an evolutionary dead end. They lasted for a long time and then they went away, and they went away because they weren't able to adapt. Here's the trick, and here's the key. I think we sometimes think that, like, by centralizing things, we can overcome that evolutionary dead end. We can avoid it. We can say, well, we can just, let me give you like a concrete example. All of our banks were failing in 2008. The response was not to say, okay, we've reached an evolutionary dead end. Like this, having banks of this size and this magnitude doesn't work. Like this is not a system that's viable. So what we need to do is essentially like reseed the mammals of, or the, the amoeba of banks, and start to create banks at a different level and a different scale. What we said is like, no, we must go in and bail out these banks. It cannot be an evolutionary dead end. Well, I think it is an evolutionary dead end. I think they will eventually crash and go away. If you respect that, and if you understand that, what you must commit yourself to is having your evolutionary dead ends happen quickly and at low cost. And the only way they have it at quickly and at low cost is to tolerate a little bit of chaos and experimentation and messiness at the local level. We seem like unable to do that today. And part of it is our political dialogue, part of it's our cultural dialogue, but a lot of it has to do with our affluence. I mean, when you see a problem and you can solve it, we, in a just society, feel like we have to do what it takes to solve it.
Mm-hmm.
And that empowers a lot of, what I think is compassionate thinking, but ultimately destructive thinking. Our federal government, our state governments have become the ultimate helicopter parents of our local governments. And I use that analogy because we understand that a helicopter parent can solve a problem for their child today, but they do it at the expense of that child's long-term capacity to solve their own problems.
Mm-hmm.
And that is exactly what we've done.
It feels like you're speaking directly to what's happening in my county, which is, I live in a county about 25 miles outside of DC, and there's a debate raging about planning and zoning and town centers and what they're going to look like. And in the meantime, there's been big tax breaks to an energy company, and then our commissioners are traveling to New York once a year to make sure we have that AAA debt borrowing, whatever that score is.
Right.
And it's as a resident, you're going, okay, so the most important thing right now to the commissioners is getting that AAA rating so they can then take on more debt and be considered credible borrowers. It's, as I'm running my household budget, I don't think, oh, well, how can I more easily take on more debt at a low interest rate? I want to think, maybe I shouldn't get that tax break so then I could get the taxes and actually start paying off the debt. It's just so fascinating.
You only worry about your credit score when you're dependent on more credit, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. What you're describing is a phenomena that I talk about a little bit in chapter 9. Our local governments, and this is not to impugn anyone who works in them. I mean, I think some of the most brilliant people in our country work for local governments. Some of the hardest working, most dedicated people do. But local governments today in the United States are oriented up the government food chain. They are obsessed because they've coalesced around this idea of kinetic growth from the outside. They become obsessed functionally with the programs that they can access to get money from the state, to get money from the federal government, or to bring in outside development capital largely flowing through Wall Street. And so everybody working at City Hall understands that the developer walking in the door with outside money is really, really important. And the resident walking in with a complaint about the trees overgrown on the sidewalk or the potholes in the street, yes, that's our constituent, whatever, but that's important. But that's not as important. That's not a highest priority as this developer walking in the door or this state program or the legislator coming to visit, because that's where our new money is coming from. Mm-hmm. And that's just a fundamental misunderstanding of what a city, not only what a city is, but how wealth is actually created in a place. When we reorient ourselves to, and I'm going to use this same analogy, but I think it's flawed, to look down at our residents, instead of focusing up the government food chain, focus down at our residents. And here's how I would say it. If we actually focus on serving the needs of the people in our community, what we find is that there are all kinds of struggles people are having to live in the places that we've created. There's tons of struggles. And a lot of those struggles are very easy to address, and very cheap to address. And when we focus on those, addressing those struggles, when we take those small incremental steps to make life a little bit better, there's enormous gain from that. Real financial gain. If we are interested in making great financial investments, they come at the block level. And they come by humbly observing where people struggle and by responding iteratively to those struggles. If we call on cities to opt out of this larger system, I mean, you need to take steps to reorient your staff, to reorient your local government, to instead of being people who try to catch the outside capital that falls on you and doing all the gymnastics and things needed to happen to make that work. If you tend to, in a meat and potatoes diet and exercise kind of way, the basics in your neighborhoods, you will see enormous returns on those investments. Mm. And not only that, you're going to be helping people live better lives. I mean, that's to me, a city is us coming together to govern ourselves. That is a hyper local undertaking, one that the state and federal government can help with in some ways, but one that should be focused on us as a community, not on what the next federal program is or the next state program is, or what something in Washington, in Wall Street can shower some money on us.
Interesting. So this is related then to a question TJ on the Facebook feed asked, which is, Washington State is currently experiencing significant population and economic growth, particularly in the central Puget Sound region. Do you have any recommendations for these local planners that we were just talking about in that area on what to do or stop doing? And is there a way that they can properly absorb this growth? So in these emerging areas, what kind of suggestions do you have for them?
Well, I wrote a whole book of, right, of suggestions for them. So read the book. Let's just contextualize a couple of things about that. Oftentimes today, we look at places that are growing and we say, well, that place is successful. And a place that isn't growing as that place is struggling. And so we equate growth with success, and for good reasons. I described earlier in our conversation the sugar high that communities get when they're growing. And it makes it so that there's a very, I think, natural, innate connection that we make as a culture between places that are shiny and new and places that are kind of older and struggling. When we look into the financials of that correlation breaks down. We show time and time again here at Strong Towns. We quote a lot from a group called Urban 3 out of North Carolina, who's done a lot of these productivity models around the country. And we show that financial success is not tied to being new. In fact, oftentimes it is most closely aligned with neighborhoods that are really old, even those that are blighted and don't look like they're doing well. So to me, I think the first understanding that people have, or other places around the country that are experiencing this, is to understand that growth does not equal prosperity. Growth does not equal success. It is not going to automatically make your place better off. Growth can give you a sugar high the same way that eating a Snickers bar will give you a sugar high. But it's way different than diet and exercise. It's way different than, a healthy diet, a healthy way of approaching life. So don't equate the two, and don't allow the growth to kind of bail you out from asking more difficult questions. I think just in general, then you said, how would you assimilate this growth, or how would you accommodate this growth? How would you do it? I would start with this as like a mental exercise. Every city that I've ever interacted with in Washington State, and I was just there 3 weeks ago, spent 4 days there giving talks all over the state. Every city I've interacted with is financially insolvent, has more long-term liabilities than they have tax capacity. They have wealth to meet those obligations. So whatever growth you're bringing in needs to be accommodated within the system without adding any more roads, without adding any more pipe, without adding any more curb or concrete or steel. Just revenue, way more assets, way more wealth without growing your liabilities. And in fact, I think the challenge that most cities, particularly those in the Western states and along the coast where they're almost their entire development pattern is post 1950, these are places that are actually going to contract dramatically in terms of the amount of land that they are now serving with these very expensive infrastructure systems. The math is just not there to support them. So if you're going to continue to grow, it's going to be growing in a far more frugal and thoughtful way. And it's going to involve far fewer resources per increment of growth. And I think how that math problem works out on the ground is going to be something we're going to struggle with to figure out for decades, really.
So related, you've been discussing infrastructure, and in the book you talk about the cult of infrastructure. How do you think it got so pervasive in our culture to have this kind of cult of infrastructure, as you put it?
I actually think it's very simple in its foundation. It's grown to be kind of a madness or a mania in a sense. But I think the foundation of it is very simple. We got out of World War II, and our macroeconomists, and I'm not going to argue with them. I think they were probably correct. Our macroeconomists said, look, we just went through a decade of depression. The only thing that got us through that depression was to ship off millions of our working age men overseas, to draft tons of our women, both to either go overseas or to backfill factory jobs, building ships and tanks and weapons and all the things of war that you are just going to blow up and destroy. Now that we're done doing that, what happens? And the brightest economists at the time said, we're just going to go right back to depression. Like, there's nothing fundamentally different about the economy in 1945 that there is in 1935. Why would we not go right back into depression? When all these millions of people came home, when we laid off all these workers who were building all this stuff, what are they going to do? What they did, and what we created an economy do, is to build this new version of America. We took all of this industrial capacity that we had. We took all of this, the men and women who were working, the industry, all this stuff, and we redirected it into building this new version of America. Let's reshape an entire continent, solve all the problems of the city that have plagued us for thousands of years. We now have oil and automobiles and plastics and all this stuff, and we can go out and, in almost like a Walt Disney dream kind of fashion, we can just fix all these problems. And that's what they did. That's exactly what they did. And so if you look at the economic textbooks and you look at the economic models, they correlate the 1950s and the 1960s, which were amazing years of growth, with infrastructure spending. The more we spend on infrastructure, the more our economy grows. And that has been an axiom, a kind of like a given that all economists seem to buy into to one degree or another, even the ones that are skeptical about GDP growth and all these other, kind of top line metrics that macroeconomics kind of solidifies around. When you listen to economists, they will say, well, we should be doing other things like building infrastructure. That correlation is flawed. And I think just like a logical sense, we can clearly see that. If you build a 2-lane highway to connect two cities that are remote from each other, let's use an example here from my home state. If you connect Minneapolis to Chicago with a 2-lane interstate road or a 4-lane interstate highway back in the 1950s, you utterly transform the economies of those places, right? Like, now what had to travel by train on certain schedules can travel any time of day at volume. It utterly transforms the economies of those two places. But when you go and you add a 9th and a 10th lane to the beltway around Minneapolis or Chicago, you're not doing anything transformative. You're quite literally, by the math that's even being presented, saving people 10, 15, 20 seconds on their commute in theory, not even in reality, just in theory. These are not transformative investments, yet they are many, many multiples more expensive than the infrastructure we built back in the 50s and 60s. We've essentially built the low-hanging fruit. And in the low-hanging fruit construction, we created this ideology that was very conducive to the political left in this country and their idea of government economics being able to transform the economy. It was very conducive to the political right in this economy, where we could make strategic investments, and that would create this platform for capitalism and markets and industry. And we just took those observations of those early investments and embedded them in who we are and what our approach is. And the results have become cult-like. Because as I show in the book, we publish these studies that say things like, we'll save, if we don't invest in infrastructure, it's going to cost us $1.1 trillion. And then like 3 pages later, they say, how much do we need to invest? 2.2 trillion. And you're like, well, wait a sec. That doesn't make any sense at all. But these are reported in these respectable journals. They're picked up by major media, and it's run as if it's somehow fact. And it's quoted by politicians and macroeconomists and others who are prestigious as fact, when a third grader can tell you that this is absurd. To me, that's cult-like behavior. And I struggled for a long time to identify it. And I finally, it's like, this is a cult, because we really have this belief that we don't question, even though I think someone from the outside looking at it would find it very easy to question.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think we have accepted a lot of those pillars for the past several decades. Switching gears a little bit, in some of the outlines of the chapters, you discuss cost productivity, which neighborhoods, and can you break down for us how to factor in what type of development will be productive? So thinking in terms of the broad strokes, like cities, suburbia, or rural, what does the cost productivity look like in those areas, and why?
There's some broad guidelines that have emerged in the work that we've done, but particularly in the work that Joe Minicozzi's group, Urban 3 in Asheville, has done, that look at value per acre. Value per acre, and let me just diverge for a short bit here. This is not a metric that I was ever taught in engineering school and planning school anywhere. It's one that Joe showed me and started to look at neighborhoods. You can think of a farm field, that grows corn. The parts of the field that grow the most robustly, where you have the most bushels per acre, we say that that's the most productive part of the field. When we look at cities and we say, where's the most productive part of the city? Where do you get the most value per acre? It's generally places that were built pre-1930. It's generally places that are more walkable than auto-oriented. Oftentimes, it's places that are occupied by poor people, not wealthy people, places that are blighted. These are actually more productive financially. They actually have more value per acre. It's fascinating because Joe and I were, I gave a lecture at Harvard, and Joe was there when I did that. And him and I were hanging out. He went to graduate school there. We were going through the library in the School of Design. And we were looking at these textbooks from the late 1800s, these town building. In fact, I have a couple here on the fly. I have a couple of these right here, like city planning. This is like from the late 1800s. You go through these and they have this one metric over and over and over again that they refer to, value per acre. Mm-hmm. And they say, what's the value per acre of your development pattern? How high is your value per acre? Are you getting good value per acre? This is a metric that is not like 100% correlated with success. So there are places where you can have high value per acre, but you're insolvent. There are places where you can have low value per acre, but financially you're doing okay. But what this does on a macro scale is it correlates better than anything that I've found with the actual success of a place. if you are generating high productivity, if you're essentially making good use of land, you will find it easier to fix and maintain, the systems. You'll find your city to be more financially solvent. And I think if you're doing it right, you're also paying attention to the human elements of urban design, of neighborhood layout. You're creating economic ecosystems that are not just single use, but have multiple uses in a neighborhood on a block. These are all things that our ancestors, and I say that in the broadest possible sense of the word, from around the world for thousands of years, dealt with and struggled with. Value per acre is a good kind of back of the envelope way to measure that. And if we just started with that as a way to analyze our places, I think it would lead us to all kinds of interesting questions that we could start to struggle with.
Fascinating. So I think we have time for one more question, and it's just kind of an anecdotal one. So from your research over the years, do you have examples that immediately come to mind of cities or towns that are doing a good job at the principles we've been talking about?
I'm starting off this book tour in Memphis, Tennessee. And I think more than any other place, Memphis, Tennessee is the one where not only has our message been influential, where they've taken things that we have suggested and run with them, but I also think the opposite, where the things that they have done organically have really inspired and influenced us. Memphis is, by all like macroeconomic statistics, if you go to the U.S. Census and start looking up statistics, or you go to the Bureau of Labor, you go get any macro thing, and Memphis is going to come out on the short end. They line up on all the desperation places, with Detroit and other cities that deeply, deeply struggle. Yet what we see in Memphis is this kind of wellspring of human capital and human entrepreneurship and community kind of cohesion, and the idea that you can make small incremental changes in a neighborhood and have that result in something far greater than what you put into it. What we've learned in Memphis and what we've seen demonstrated by them over and over, and this is not us, this is them as leaders, really, I think national leaders, is that when you go out and pay attention to details, when you go out and pay attention to where people struggle, when you orient yourself around the block, around the neighborhood, amazing things can happen. I've seen places in Memphis where they went out with brooms and paintbrushes and just cleaned up a block, and things, just like emerge. They start to, they unleash this energy in a place. Memphis is a very exciting place, and I would highly recommend anyone who wants to see what can be done when you come to grips with the fact that you have to hack your way to success. You can't just import it. You can't just borrow your way to it. You can't like magic project it, into existence. You actually have to deal with life. And that means hacking things and making things a little bit better and tolerating that it won't be the best, but you're on a path to getting it there. To me, Memphis is the ideal example of that mentality embodied in a municipality. And I'm really proud to be going there on Wednesday to kick off this whole book tour. I'm also very humbled because, it's the one place where I've worked with intimately, where they've said, this really helps, and have actually done a lot of the things that we've recommended they do. And I think to great benefit. They've really benefited from a strong towns approach in a way that I think a lot of cities will.
I'm sure that's got to be very encouraging to see and witness.
It is. Let me just say again, these people are inspiring to me. I mean, this is me as the outsider saying, "Hey, you think about this and this," and then them taking it to like a new level. I mean, these are some of the most entrepreneurial, deeply intelligent, thoughtful people I've ever run into. So yeah, they're very inspiring.
Great. So where can readers buy your book?
You can buy it anywhere. You can buy it anywhere. In fact, I've been kind of hounded to write this book for a long time, and I waited until we could get the right deal at the right time with the right publisher, because we didn't want this to just be available on Amazon. You can certainly get it there. We want it to be available in every local bookstore all over the world. And so you can go to your local bookstore. You can go to wherever you would get books, and you'll be able to get it in that place and get it quickly.
So walk, hopefully in your walkable communities, to your local bookstore and pick up a copy tomorrow, correct?
Tomorrow, there's some that have already crept out into the world. My brother texted me this morning and said, "I'm in chapter 4 and I like it." So he got his somewhere. I know people are getting them now because we're starting to see them pop up. But yeah, tomorrow is when it'll be widely available.
Great. Well, congratulations on your new book, Chuck, and thank you for chatting with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation and for taking the time. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. And as always, if you're listening and you want to know more, please feel free to email us at editor@ballotpedia.org. And please feel free to subscribe to our newsletters, including our daily brew and our weekly tap, and any other issues you might be interested in. So we will talk to you in a month and see you soon. Have a great Monday.
Take care.
You guys.